And then one day it came to me that I really have to decide what I want to do in life. So I decided that I wanted to become an actor. Before I left Hong Kong, Bruce and I talked, and he said, look, Jim, we're going to do another film. Next thing I knew, you know what happened?
There's a photograph from 1973 that a lot of people have seen without ever knowing who's actually in it. Bruce Lee stands at the center, as always. But just off to his side is a tall black man with an enormous afro, a calm, unreadable expression, and a presence that somehow doesn't shrink even next to the most famous martial artist who ever lived. That man is Jim Kelly. For a few short years in the 1970s, he was one of the biggest action stars on the planet. Then, almost overnight, he vanished. No scandal, no arrest, no tearful confession on a talk show. He simply stopped showing up. For nearly 3 decades, most of the world had no idea what had happened to him, whether he was still alive, or why a man who once shared the screen with Bruce Lee walked away from Hollywood at the height of his fame. The real answer is stranger, sadder, and more admirable than anything the tabloids ever guessed. Jim Kelly was born on May 5, 1946, in Millersburg, Kentucky, a small town that, like much of the American South at the time, still operated under the daily machinery of segregation. Water fountains marked colored and white weren't relics of a distant past for Kelly's generation. They were simply how the world worked. He grew up watching adults around him navigate a country that had already decided, before he ever spoke a word, how far it intended to let him go. Kelly found his outlet in sports. At Bourbon County High School, he became something close to a local legend, excelling in basketball, football, and track. He had the kind of raw athletic talent that coaches build entire programs around, and it eventually earned him a football scholarship to the University of Louisville. For a black teenager in the mid-1960s, that scholarship wasn't just an opportunity. It was a rare crack in a wall that rejected almost everyone who looked like him. But college didn't turn out to be the escape he hoped for. During a football practice, a coach directed a racial slur at a black teammate in front of the entire squad. Nobody intervened. Nobody apologized. It was treated as normal. For Kelly, that single moment collapsed the illusion that hard work and talent were enough to earn him fair treatment inside that institution. He didn't file a complaint or wait for the situation to blow over. He packed his things and left campus, walking away from the scholarship, the team, and the path everyone assumed he was supposed to follow. It would have been easy to read that decision as the end of something. It turned out to be the beginning. After leaving Louisville, Kelly drifted toward something that had nothing to do with football scoreboards or coaches with clipboards. He walked into a small karate dojo in Lexington, Kentucky, and discovered Shorin Ryu, a demanding Okinawan style built around speed, precision, and total physical discipline. For the first time, Kelly found himself in a space where advancement wasn't handed out based on who liked you or what you looked like. You earned your rank by getting hit, getting back up, and getting better. He trained obsessively, often for hours a day, absorbing lessons from a rotating cast of instructors who pushed him past what most students were willing to endure. The training was brutal. Broken bones, swollen joints, days where simply standing upright took effort. Kelly kept showing up anyway. By 1971, that obsession had turned him into one of the most feared competitors in American karate. He entered the Long Beach International Karate Championships, one of the most prestigious tournaments in the country, and walked out as the world middleweight karate champion. That same year, he added several more titles to his name, cementing himself as one of the top competitive martial artists in the United States, at a time when there were almost no black champions occupying that space at all. Riding that momentum, Kelly moved to Los Angeles and opened his own dojo in the Crenshaw district. It wasn't a flashy operation. It was small, serious, and built entirely around discipline. But something about Kelly's presence, quiet, composed, impossible to rattle, started drawing an unusual crowd. Actors, athletes, people from the entertainment industry who had heard there was a real champion teaching real karate a few miles from the studios. Nobody in that dojo could have predicted that within 2 years, one of Kelly's students would accidentally hand him a movie career. Kelly's first brush with the film industry wasn't the product of headshots or casting calls. He was hired to teach karate to actor Calvin Lockhart, who was starring in a 1972 thriller called Melinda. The production needed someone to play a small role as a martial arts instructor, and since Kelly was already on set day after day working with the lead, somebody simply asked if he wanted the part. He'd never acted before in his life. It didn't matter. He wasn't really performing a character. He was playing himself, doing exactly what he already did for a living. That performance caught the attention of producer Fred Weintraub, who had spent months assembling the cast for an ambitious international co-production starring Bruce Lee. One of the actors originally attached to a key supporting role had dropped out just before filming was set to begin in Hong Kong, and Weintraub was scrambling to find a replacement. Word reached him about a real-life karate champion running a dojo in Crenshaw. He would see for himself. What he found wasn't just a skilled fighter. It was someone who carried himself with an effortless, unbothered confidence that no amount of coaching could fake. Weintraub offered him the role on the spot. The film was Enter the Dragon. The character was Williams. The year was 1973, and Jim Kelly was about to become one of the most quietly revolutionary figures in the history of American action cinema. Enter the Dragon went on to become one of the highest-grossing and most influential martial arts films ever made, eventually selected for preservation by the Library of Congress for its cultural and historical significance. Most retrospectives understandably center on Bruce Lee. Far fewer stop to examine exactly what Jim Kelly represented on that screen. Williams wasn't comic relief. He wasn't a sidekick invented to make the lead look better by comparison. He was composed, self-assured, and completely free of the servile or clownish traits that Hollywood had, up to that point, almost exclusively assigned to black characters. He didn't explain himself. He didn't apologize for taking up space. For black audiences sitting in theaters in 1973, that image landed as something genuinely new. Not simply a black man on screen, but a black man portrayed as a whole, dignified, dangerous equal. By all accounts, Kelly earned the role through nothing more than presence. He walked into the audition, delivered a single line, and that was essentially it. Director Robert Klaus knew immediately. Bruce Lee, watching from the side, reportedly agreed without hesitation. The two men built a real friendship over the course of filming, bonding not just as co-stars, but as martial artists who respected each other's discipline. Lee reportedly told Kelly he wanted to make another film together, one where the two of them would face off as rivals. That film never happened. Bruce Lee died suddenly on July 20th, 1973, just weeks before Enter the Dragon reached theaters. For Kelly, it wasn't just the loss of a colleague. It was the loss of the one person in the industry who had treated him as a true equal rather than a novelty. Everything that came after unfolded in an industry that would prove far less generous. Almost immediately after Enter the Dragon's release, the press settled on a shorthand for Kelly that would follow him for the rest of his career: the Black Bruce Lee. On the surface, it sounds like flattery. In practice, it was a cage. It defined Kelly entirely in relation to another man, as though his own identity, skill, and screen presence weren't sufficient reasons for people to know his name. Kelly rejected the label every chance he got. He admired Bruce Lee immensely and never hid that. But being reduced to an imitation, a stand-in, a version of, wasn't respect. It flattened everything that made him distinct. Every script that landed on his desk afterward seemed to be measured against the same impossible question. Could this be the next Bruce Lee vehicle, just with a different actor? Almost nobody in the industry seemed interested in asking what a film built specifically around Jim Kelly, on his own terms, might look like. Despite that ceiling, Kelly still managed a genuinely successful run. Black Belt Jones arrived in 1974 to strong box office numbers. That same year, Three the Hard Way paired him with fellow action stars Jim Brown and Fred Williamson in a film where three black leads took on a white supremacist plot together. A premise almost unthinkable in mainstream American cinema just a decade earlier. Black audiences turned out in force. For a brief moment, it felt like an entirely new era of action filmmaking, one built by and for people who had never been allowed to lead it before, was here to stay. It wasn't. By the late 1970s, major studios began quietly walking away from the entire genre that had made Kelly a star. The official reasoning offered to the public was concern over glorified violence. The real story was less about content and more about a broader cultural shift. America's political mood was turning conservative. and the appetite that had briefly opened space for black-led action heroes narrowed just as quickly as it had appeared. The industry pivoted toward a new template of tough, stoic, overwhelmingly white leading men, ushering in the era that would soon give audiences Rocky, then Rambo, then a wave of action franchises with barely a black lead in sight. Kelly kept receiving scripts throughout this period, but most of them offered him nothing resembling the character he'd played in Enter the Dragon or Black Belt Jones. They were thin roles, written to look tough on camera, without any real interior life, designed to exist purely in service of a white protagonist story. Kelly turned many of them down. He wasn't interested in playing a prop, regardless of the paycheck attached to it. That refusal came at a cost. Word spread through informal industry channels that Kelly was difficult, a label frequently attached to black performers in that era who declined to accept whatever they were offered without complaint. By the late 1970s, the phone had essentially stopped ringing. There was no formal announcement that his career was over. There didn't need to be. The silence spoke for itself. While many of his peers from that era spent the years that followed scrambling for smaller roles or struggling to adjust to sudden irrelevance, Jim Kelly did something almost nobody expected. He picked up a tennis racket. He'd started playing casually in the mid-1970s, even while his film career was still active, hitting balls at a public park in West Hollywood in whatever spare time he had. Once the studio offers dried up, tennis stopped being a hobby and became his focus. Kelly joined the USTA senior competitive circuit and climbed to the number 2 ranking in California in senior men's doubles, breaking into the state's top 10 in singles as well. Think about what that actually means. A man who had already reached the summit of competitive karate, becoming a world champion in his 20s, went on to reach a competitive, ranked level in an entirely different sport in his second act. That's not a retirement hobby. That's a second athletic career built through the same relentless discipline that carried him through the dojo years. Almost nobody on the tennis circuit recognized him. He wore simple clothes and a baseball cap, coached kids at a local club for income, and drove an old Porsche without any interest in flaunting the fame he'd once had. Friends from that period described someone who trained daily, avoided excess entirely, and never once brought up the fact that he used to stand next to Bruce Lee on a movie set. Eventually, Kelly settled in San Diego and opened his own tennis club, staying almost entirely out of the public eye. No interviews chasing nostalgia, no convention circuit, no attempt to cash in on his old fame. For close to 30 years, the wider world simply lost track of him, and plenty of people assumed he'd either faded into obscurity or passed away long before he actually did. Here's the part worth sitting with. Jim Kelly didn't get pushed out and then quietly fade away in defeat. He looked clearly at what Hollywood was offering him, recognized it for what it was, and chose something else entirely. There's a real difference between a man the industry discards and a man who sees the terms being offered and decides they're not worth accepting. On a tennis court, nobody needed him to represent anything. Nobody cared what he symbolized. The ball either landed in or it didn't. That kind of clarity, after years of being flattened into a label, wasn't a fallback plan. It was a form of freedom. Kelly married 3 times over the course of his life. His first marriage, to Marilyn Dishman in 1967, lasted just over a year. His second, to actress Rosalind Miles, spanned 1973 to 1977, overlapping almost exactly with his years of biggest fame. His third marriage, to Marcia Bentley in 1980, became the lasting foundation of the rest of his life, lasting more than 3 decades. Kelly and Bentley had a daughter, Sabrina, whose existence remained almost entirely unknown to the public. There were no red carpet family appearances, no magazine profiles featuring the household, no interviews built around his personal life. Kelly protected that part of himself with the same total discipline he brought to everything else he cared about. When asked years later why he never discussed his family publicly, his answer was simple. It was the one part of his life that still belonged only to him. In the early 2010s, Kelly was diagnosed with cancer. He never confirmed the exact type publicly, and he chose not to share the diagnosis beyond his wife and a small circle of close friends. There was no farewell tour, no public statement preparing fans for what was coming. He handled it the same way he handled the end of his film career decades earlier, privately, and on his own terms. Jim Kelly died at his home in San Diego on June 29, 2013, at the age of 67. Marcia Bentley released a brief statement afterward, saying simply that he had lived the way he wanted to. Strong, quiet, and free. Even in death, the silence he'd spent decades protecting got disrupted. Inaccurate rumors briefly circulated online, misreporting the cause of his passing, and Bentley eventually had to step forward to correct the record and confirm the truth. It was a strange, fitting footnote to the life of a man who had spent 30 years making sure the world knew almost nothing about him. When he was finally gone, people who barely remembered him felt compelled to invent a dramatic story just to fill the silence he'd left behind. In the days after his death, tributes appeared in major outlets, and respected film critics described him as a defining figure for a generation of black moviegoers who had rarely, if ever, seen themselves reflected on screen as whole, dignified heroes. Those tributes were deserved, but focusing only on the films misses the more important part of Kelly's story. Jim Kelly was the first black martial arts star in American film history, a fact that's well documented and beyond dispute. But his real legacy isn't only what he did on camera. It's what he refused to do once the industry stopped offering him roles worth taking. He didn't perform gratitude for an industry that was using him. He didn't compromise on the kind of characters he was willing to play just to stay visible. And when the opportunities disappeared, he didn't collapse or spend the rest of his life chasing relevance. He walked onto a tennis court and built an entirely new competitive identity from scratch. Every actor who came after him and got to play a black lead who was allowed to be complicated, flawed, and fully human without that humanity being read as a threat owes something to the ground Kelly and a handful of his contemporaries broke open. He never got to fully enjoy the industry he helped push forward. But the shift happened anyway, because people like him refused to accept the limits it tried to put on them. Jim Kelly didn't need applause to know exactly who he was. The silence that followed him for 30 years wasn't a sign that the world forgot him. It was a life lived entirely on his own terms, in a system that rarely allowed people who looked like him that privilege. And in the end, that quiet, uncompromising refusal to be diminished is exactly what makes his story worth telling now.